So we'll go ahead and get started. There may be a few more people trickling in person and online. That's totally fine. Welcome to the map chat. This is probably the most people we've had at any of our map chats, so that's really exciting. So a map chat is basically an informal talk that we do periodically throughout the semester, usually. Today, of course, it's not the semester, really. Well, technically it's the summer semester. But summertime, we don't usually have these, but because we have this wonderful exhibition happening in the map library, which I hope some of you have had a chance to go look at, or maybe after this we'll go look at, we thought we'd do one of these in the summertime. So it's great to have you all here. Welcome to the cartography lab where you're sitting right now if you're here in person. We are, of course, part of the Department of Geography, and we are part of the cartography and GIS major. And so if any of you are interested in majoring in cartography or geography, or know people who might be interested, please feel free to ask me questions, get in touch with us. We're happy to talk about it. So my name is Alicia Cowart, and I'm the creative director of the cartography lab. Rob Roth, who is on Zoom, is the director, and Bill Lipasathian is a professor in the department as well, along with Rob Ross. He is the associate director of this lab.
PhD in Oregon.
Oh, yes. Bill Lipasathian did his PhD at the University of Oregon, which is where Mark Fonstad, who I'm introducing today, is a professor in geography. And an alum of UW-Madison. So we're very excited to have him here today. So if any of you came to the talk last week, were any of you there? Some of you? Oh, great. Mark talked a little bit more sort of biographical about his mother, Karen Wynn Fonstad, who of course is the cartographer of all the wonderful maps you are seeing upstairs in the map library. Mark is, of course, her son. So we talked a little bit more about her life and her work and how she got into mapping fantasy worlds. And today, my understanding is he's going to talk a little bit more about her process. So a little bit more about how she went about making these maps, what tools she used, what was her way of thinking about them. So hopefully you find this interesting. We will have a little bit of time at the end for Q&A. I can moderate that, of course, if you want, and we'll have folks online as well. If you have questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat, and we can address those as well. And I guess without any further ado, I will welcome Mark Fonstad.
Thank you, Alicia. Welcome, everyone. So I've been told I have to kind of talk this direction. If I walk over here, bad things happen. So forgive me if I'm not looking way over here as much as I should. That's why. Welcome to the University of Wisconsin in geography. Again, I'm Mark Fonstad. I teach at the University of Oregon. I got my bachelor's degree here in this very building, and I lived up in a little desk right above what no longer exists, second floor here. So I have fond memories of this room, although the room looked very different then. Last week, I gave a talk downstairs in the big room on kind of a biography of my mother, Karen Wynn Fonstad, who's a fantasy cartographer. That was great, but and there are lots of people there. It was wonderful. The only thing is that took up nearly an hour. Well, 45 minutes, something like that. So today, what I'm going to do is not talk so much about biography and instead focus on one particular thing that she's most known for, and that is her work on Middle Earth, the Atlas of Middle Earth. So today is going to be more of a mapping kind of a day. And if you are interested in that afterwards, and you haven't done so already, I recommend going upstairs to the third floor where we have the exhibit of her work. What's shown is maybe 5% of the total output of what she has. You know, there's only so much space. Let people move in here. While people are setting up, why can't I change slides?
You might have it.
Nope. There we go. So if to get a lucky click. Just a couple quick notes before I get going. I want to point out for those of you who are interested in cartography that this program here, we have professional programs in addition to standard degrees, like in geography. There is a accelerated non-thesis master's degree in GIS and cartography, can be done as little as 1 year, and basically take 4 core courses. And if you are interested, go down to this link. Okay. Uh-oh. All the text can be cut off today. Well, we'll move on. So my mother's name is not Erin, it was Karen. I will do just a quick little bio because most of you weren't here last week. So my mother was born in Oklahoma, in Norman, Oklahoma. She was one of several children, and her older brother, Bill, who is here, she was very interested in art, even at a very early age. And he taught her perspective because he had some technical drafting abilities. And as you'll see later on, that perspective ability became a major part of her work. She majored in she started as a major in art. At the time in the 60s, the art world was very much like pop art and abstract expressionism, and she just didn't fit in. She was a representational artist. So she ended up, after back and forthing, as a geography master's student, where she worked as a teaching assistant in cartography. And it was there that one of the students was trying to work on a map of Middle Earth, which she had never heard of before. The student wasn't particularly good, didn't finish the map, but she was interested in what it was. Later on, a friend of hers loaned her the first book, and very quickly she read the whole thing and got very interested in J.R.R. Tolkien, and began to imagine making one big, huge map of Middle Earth. And that didn't ever come to be, because the more she thought about it, the more challenging she realized such a map would have to be, complicated, in order to have everything on it that might be of interest. And things really changed in 1977 or 78 or 77 with the publication of the Silmarillion. If any of you have read Lord of the Rings, the Silmarillion is kind of I was going to say a prequel, but it's kind of like a history of the world. And it's, when you read it, she realized immediately it'd be impossible to put everything in there on a map. So she said, well, in geography, that is why we have atlases. That was the birth of the idea. And she basically cold called Houghton Mifflin, the publisher of Lord of the Rings and the other books. And very quickly they said yes. And that was the beginning of the first edition of the Atlas of Middle Earth. My mother worked on those atlases, several atlases during the 1980s. In the 1990s, she did different things, like she worked as a physical therapist, which was actually her undergrad degree. She taught cartography occasionally as a lecturer, and she died of cancer in 2005. She did get to see the Lord of the Rings movies. She managed to make it through. Okay. So this is just an example of one of her maps behind her. And on the right are a couple of maps from the Atlas of Pern, I think. No, that's Atlas of the Dragonlance world, which I'm not going to talk about today, but which is upstairs. So since today is about the Atlas of Middle Earth, it's important, I think, for me to spend just a couple of minutes talking about J.R.R. Tolkien. So Tolkien is the author of Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, The Silmarillion, and did most of the writing that ended up in lots of other books, including the History of Middle Earth series, Unfinished Tales, several volumes. He fought in World War I, and saw a lot of his friends die. And if you watch Lord of the Rings movies or read the book, you can immediately get a sense of the World War I in many of the things that happen in Lord of the Rings and in The Hobbit. And he, even during World War I, but especially right after, began to write about a fictional world. He was an academic. He worked at Oxford University. He was by training a philologist. So he studied languages. He was a medieval scholar. He studied Beowulf and taught English and a number of other things. And throughout his life, he worked on this big fantasy history, fictional history that for him meant the fictional history of England. Even though the landscapes he wrote about no longer really existed in his mind. Also, he got the idea to write a children's book, a very small version of it, that ended up becoming less of a children's book, but eventually was published as The Hobbit. And then in the 1950s, he wrote a sequel to that, The Lord of the Rings, which is the books he's most famous for, probably. But as you can see here, there's a lot of his books, and that becomes important in a couple of minutes when I talk about how do you go about mapping this fictional world. Okay, so today I'm going to focus on these two atlases that my mother did. They are the first and the original and the revised versions of the Atlas of Middle Earth. The original atlas was written or produced in the late 1970s. So basically 1978 through 1980. I think it was published in 1981. It took her 2.5 years to do the first edition. Many of the maps that are upstairs are from the first edition. The revised version on the right came about in the very late 80s and was eventually published in 1991. I was in high school at the time and I was able to watch everything that was going on. The reason that there was a revised version will become apparent later because during the 1980s, many of the History of Middle-earth volumes that were published by Tolkien's son, Christopher, were published, and many of them contained lots of information that she didn't have available to her when the original was published. Okay, so that's enough of kind of bio and history. I want to talk more about the atlas and the maps and the texts themselves. So a lot of this is, well, let me put it this way. Much of this material is like you'd only ever find this for the Atlas of Middle Earth. But most of the concepts and ideas are the things that geographers and cartographers grapple with all the time. And when we teach students how to make maps or we teach them how to describe something geographically, these are many of the questions that we deal with every single day. It's like it's our major part of our training. So for example, if you are interested in cartography and you want to map Tolkien's world, you are under no obligation to do it any way other than the way you want it. If that is the case, you are the audience. You're the person that is the one that wants to see the end result. You might enjoy the process or whatever, but the way you picture it in your head, that is the audience. That's what you want to see. You're the audience. The only trouble with that is that if you want it to be your thing and you want other people to be an audience, then you have to have art as a communication, right? You have to think, okay, are people going to want to see just the thing that's just in my head, or do they want to see something in addition or something different? Well, that's the nature of the challenge for cartographers. So we often have things that we wish to see in our heads, but then we often say, well, what do our audience want to see? Who is the audience? In fact, you can have an infinite number of maps for anything you could think of. Question is, who is it that you're trying to satisfy? I'm looking over here because one of the books that was lying around in the cart lab is the Atlas of Yellowstone, which was produced at the University of Oregon. And the pages that are open is the waterfalls of Yellowstone, which I helped with that book. And it was a real challenge because there are lots and lots of waterfalls in Yellowstone. And we were like, what is this page for? Right. And the page, eventually we decided that the whole point of the page was to get people interested in going to see waterfalls. Right. So we had to be able to make it in such a way to communicate where things were like they were. In the case of the Atlas of Middle Earth, my mother decided that if she was going to make an atlas, which is a ton of work, like years of work, she was going to have to make it for somebody to buy. And that meant working with publishers, and it meant trying to imagine what an audience is going to want. A lot of people who want to go and read this are people who say that they have a hard time visualizing Middle Earth, or they want to know specific places. In other words, they treat it as a kind of a real place, right? That's an important part. And that's not the only way you can make maps. Like, you can make maps that are basically like medieval maps that are very unrealistic. You can make a map that is extremely realistic. You can look at examples from our own history. For example, on the upper left, that's a T&O map, which is from the medieval, sort of late medieval period in Europe, which is clearly not realistic. It's much more symbolic than it is realistic. As compared with a map like this is from the 1500s. That's very realistic for that time. Even today in modern maps, we have that same question, like over there on the right, if you know, that's the London Underground, part of the London Underground map. Well, that contains, if you've ever been to London, that map is completely hopelessly unreal in the sense that the things that are close together are often way apart, whatever, but it's very, very good for one thing, getting around. It tells you where you have to get off to go on another subway to get to another place. Like, it's good for one specific thing. And that's important for us. How do we choose what to add and what not to add? By the way, even in mapping Tolkien, we see this wide variety of ways of representing things. For example, up there on the right, this is from an artist named David Day, and it's often derided as the lungs map. And it's kind of, if you go on the line, lots of people hate on this map because it's very, very unrealistic. It's got all three ages of Middle Earth all mixed together and all sorts of things. It doesn't conform to the reality that Tolkien drew. And I can understand that. If the goal is to get around, that's not the map you want. On the other hand, if you think of it as a piece of abstract art, it's great. It's the goal. Tolkien himself talked about this issue when it came to writing. And I'm not going to go into detail here, other than to say up at the top, if you want to make the world believable, it has to have, this is in his mind, right? It has to have the inner consistency of reality. It has to have rules that make sense between the different parts of the writing. Because if it doesn't, your suspension of disbelief goes away. You're like, well, this is just people being random. And if you want to represent the inner consistency of reality, what you have to do is to choose to describe why things are the way they are. So if there's a green sky in your fantasy world, you have to explain why it's obvious that it would be green. And that's the case in Tolkien's world. In Tolkien's world, yes, the world is fantasy and fictional, but it conforms to realistic rules that we abide by every day. There's gravity, rivers flow downhill, mountains are bigger at the bottom than they are at the top. We see it as just a different version of our own worlds. And that's important because that we take that in, that helps us build an interaction with the place. We already know a lot about it because we live here. That's the thing. So if you're going to make an atlas, first thing is, who's your audience? Second thing is, what's your sources? If you're going to make maps, you have to be able to have information about those maps from somewhere. Well, in the case of Tolkien, Tolkien had already died. He died in 1972, the year before I was born. He had left his writings, but he hadn't worked with many cartographers. He'd only worked with a couple of people who made maps for him, his son Christopher and an English cartographer or illustrator named Pauline Baynes. And they only made kind of general global maps. So you can't, in the case of Tolkien, you can't go to him and ask him questions. That was not the case with all the other atlases my mother did. In those cases, the authors were still alive. She could go work with them, Anne McCaffrey in Ireland or whoever. But in the case of Tolkien, you're forced to live with nothing but what's written in the text. And what does that mean? It means if you want to have a world in the map that is consistent with the writing, you have to know the writing really, really well. So in that case of my mother, if you go upstairs, there are some of her books there that have all this writing all over them. And she read those books dozens of times, not only to find every sentence that had geographic information, but also so she could build up mental maps and pictures in her head. That's probably the most important step for a cartographer of fantasy worlds, is you've got to have the picture in your head before you can go make a map. There is no GIS layer here where you can click on and get all the locations of everything and what exists there. You have to be able to build up that picture yourself. So most of the information comes from text. There are a handful of other sources. Tolkien did work on a few large maps. They exist in the back of the books. This is the most famous here. This is from the Third Age of Middle-earth, and it's a global map. It doesn't have much detail, but it's his map, all right? That's important, because if we're going to be consistent with his text, this is part of the text, right? So we want to be consistent with it. Pauline Baynes, he worked with a little bit later, make it fancier, more colorful, but basically that's about it. He did a few other maps in a little bit higher detail. This is the southern part of Middle-earth, more southern, where you have Gondor and Mordor. In a couple of cases, he had a little more detail where there's lots of things going on. Tirith or the Black Gates, Mount Doom. But for the most part, this is pretty much it. He did include maps in the stories in a couple of places, the most famous being the Lonely Mountain in The Hobbit. Right? This is actually a plot point that he has. But really, there's not many of these, so you can't rely on the maps that he did in order to make an atlas. You can use them as templates, but that's pretty much it. Tolkien did doodle. He would make sketches. Many of those, they're not many, but there are some, and his artwork is held, a lot of it is held at Marquette University in Milwaukee. In the Tolkien collection at Marquette. So one of the things my mother did quite a bit when she was working on the Alice was drive from her home in Oshkosh to Milwaukee. At the time, I don't think you could photocopy or do anything like that. So she was hand copying maps that she found in the Marquette collection and using them as the basis for her own maps. So this is an example of a hand drawing she found of Minas Tirith that Tolkien had done. A lot of times he was doodling in those like blue exam books that if any of you had to do essay exams like at college, he did the same thing. So here's an example. This is one of his doodles, one of his artworks. This is Cirith Ungol. This is after Frodo is stung by Shelob and the orcs take him up to the top of a tower. It's that tower. And this is a thing that you can use to help flesh out your map. You have to use other things from text and so on. There's another example from Mount Doom over on the right. My mother basically didn't work with anyone. She was on a desert island in her mind. Late at night, she would do everything at her drafting table, and that was pretty much it. There was one exception. So the Atlas of Middle-earth is not an authorized atlas. J.R. Tolkien was not alive. However, occasionally my mother would ask questions of Christopher Tolkien, and he would answer. Christopher Tolkien died just a few years ago. Not very long ago, I can't remember, 3 or 4 years ago, I can't remember exactly. But so he lived a long time. He was the one that published the Silmarillion and had actually drawn many of the maps. So occasionally my mother had very specific questions that Christopher would ask. That was not common, but occasionally. So that's a source. These sources are not perfect, right? It's a fictional world. If you're choosing to be realistic, you're at your own danger because there's no rule. The author has to be perfect. For example, if you map out how long it took the journey for the hobbits in Lord of the Rings to get from Baggin to Rivendell, there's way less time than it took for Frodo and the dwarves and the Hobbit on ponies to get that same journey. That is not a problem of the cartographer's doing. That's the author's problem. But you are a cartographer. You have to choose what to do when there's a mistake. Like, by the way, there's a map or two upstairs that shows the struggle with this. You just have to decide, right? Which one are you gonna, which version are you gonna use? Okay, so what's the process of making the atlas? First thing, you got to decide what's going to be the final product, right? I want an atlas. I want it to be such and such a length. It's going to look like a certain thing. It's going to be black and white. It's going to have both text and maps because it's a annotated atlas, almost more like an encyclopedia than just pictures. You make a mimic of the book, a dummy that shows rough layouts of what you want. The process that my mother used, and I know this for sure because these are this is her slides. She would read these books over and over to build up mental maps in her head and go through the text to make sure that the pictures conformed with what was written in the text. Second, she would build a base map. These are large maps that have very little detail, but they have lots of, or big amounts of really simple things, like where are all the coastlines? Where are the main rivers? Where's the main topography? You'll see a couple of the base maps upstairs. Those base maps are then used to hone in and do lots of maps at over smaller areas. You have to figure out what distances things are. Tolkien was always using leagues. What is a league? If you go and look into like Roman history and medieval history, people use different lengths for what a league is. She eventually decided it's 3 miles because they're kind of very half a mile this way, a mile that way. It's 3 miles. You have to decide. Then you have to decide, okay, what landforms am I going to include? What kind of representations? And then you go through and try to decide what other kinds of maps do I want? I want maps that show the actual actions of the book. I want maps that show thematic information like climates and geology and diseases and languages. There is this whole process for checking that the map is good. I'm not going to go into too much detail other than to say, when you start with a base map, that's a way to make sure that there's consistency between one map and another. So if by some reason you have to change the base map, that's a problem, because then the problems expand into a lot of other maps. Okay, so this is what the big chunk of the work is, to do an atlas of Middle-earth. You're sitting there reading the books over and over, right, and making notes. So it's research. It's like researching a new place. And then you move over, because this is pre-digital, everything was done by hand. So you move over to a light table and you start with some kind of base layer, like a base map, and you put a new sheet of material on top and you start to draw something at higher resolution, something you want more detail. So in the case of Middle-earth, this was the original pencil base map. It's upstairs. It's pretty large. It's in pretty bad shape compared to most maps. And the reason is it was so big, she couldn't put it on the drafting table. So it was given birth on the kitchen floor. And the tiles on the kitchen floor were the scale bars. You can actually see, that's how big kitchen tiles are. And if you open up the Atlas of Middle-earth, you'll see letters and numbers on the margins. Those conform to kitchen tiles. So once this, rough map is done, then you ink it. So the map, we go in this progression of making it more and more like an actual atlas. So it's inked. It gives you much precision. The inking is done with technical pens, rapidographs with permanent ink. So you don't want to mess up at this stage. And again, there's not much detail here, but this is enough to give you information about where to put higher resolution maps. So, for example, here's a regional map of Gondor that was built and registered from that earlier base map, right? So you do just a piece of it, you expand it out, and now you can add detail. Here's where the roads are. Here's where I'm going to put text and so on. We start to make more and more topography detail as we go in. Sometimes it's a challenge. Like if you read the text, this is talking about Minas Tirith, it gives you tantalizing hints for what's in J.R. Tolkien's head. But the moment it gives you hints, then you have questions like, well, what kind of rock was it? If it was this kind of rock, it would look more like this. If it was the other kind of rock, it looked more like this. And you read the text, it doesn't tell you, right? So eventually you have to decide. In the case of Minas Tirith, it was a little bit easier because Tolkien had drawn a couple of pictures. Most of the time, you're not that lucky. In the original version of Lord of the Atlas of Middle-earth, they asked her to pretty much stick to regular top-down maps. But the revised version, they let her do a little bit more 3D, which she loved to do. And so you end up with an image that looks kind of like what they did for the Peter Jackson's movies, because they used the Atlas of Middle-earth when they did location scouting. And at the end of the atlas, you'll see all these weird numbers and sections. These are every single map and basically all the pages and all the books that talk about that location, because this becomes a huge database challenge. Okay, so that's the first start of the process. And you think, okay, I've got these mental maps. What would be the next step? Well, early in my mother's career, her next step was to doodle. What's the picture? Getting the picture in her head down on paper. This is Lonely Mountain, and the one over there is the Black Gate of Mordor. She didn't do this for very long. I think after a while, she realized that she could kind of skip the doodle phase and go straight from the mental map to the kind of finished pencil map, which would look like this, which saves a lot of time. This map has everything on it, right? It's where I'm going to put the text by hand, I'm going to put the roads, the topography. That is everything on one pencil layer, and then you begin to build up a series of layers of the components. So we'd have a layer that's topography, inked, and a layer that's roads and forests, inked and patterned, and a layer that's text. The publishers, and write on each layer what you want, like this ought to be this color. This ought to be this tone, whatever. You send all that stuff to the publisher. The publisher then uses those notes and each layer in order to photograph and burn into a plate the correct colors and screens. And that's what's printed in the atlas. So that's that kind of process. Today, it would be quite different in the digital world. You could make a full color thing in the digital world. They would do color separation and they wouldn't have to mess with all these intervening steps. But at the time, it was all analog. And it's not perfect, right? Late at night, the artist can get tired, right? So like in this case, you'll notice a black blob over here. Well, she was tired. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. She knocked over ink onto the, so you got to be careful. So it's all analog. Okay. So I'm already low on time, so I'm going to skip around a little bit. Just a couple of other things we have to think about. What do you put in and what do you leave out? So here's a famous map from England. This is William Smith's, it's the original geology map of England. And he had this big argument with another geologist over what do you put on a map, because you can't go to every place in England and see all this stuff. He interpolated, whereas the other geologist said you should only put what you can actually see. But William Smith realized that the audience doesn't know what to do with big white gaps. That might be faithful to the text or to the rocks, but it's terrible from a cartographic perspective. My mother had to make the same exact decision, right? Are you only going to put in the things that actually appear in the text, or do you try to interpolate with your own knowledge? Well, it becomes obvious, but you have to do the interpolation. So if you go and look at regional maps, for example, there's a lot of information about landscapes in the Atlas of Middle-earth in places where there's not direct textual information. But she interpolated based on she was able to kind of get into J.R. Tolkien's head about what he was imagining seeing there. So although you could make an infinite number of maps that would conform with the text, the key is just to have that consistency. Okay, so the next question is, what representations, right? The artist has to draw some kind of representation. Like originally, she was going to draw more of a medieval type, three-dimensional kind of atlas. Even the text is more medieval. She eventually decided to switch. Oh, by the way, in cartographic history in the real world, we have cultures and civilizations that often do this, like China for a long time made their landscape maps very, very artistic. So artistic, in fact, that it was actually sometimes difficult to represent actual distances and areas. Like in this one, perspective varies depending upon where in the map you are. It's actually challenging to make measurements. But my mother, for her master's thesis, had actually studied how modern cartographers do their representations. This is sort of mid-20th century. And so she used those representations, for example, physiography or topography. This is Armin Lobeck, who taught here in this department, I think. And this is even a different one. This is Erwin Rice's map. This is actually a quite famous map. And if you look at this, it looks a lot like the Atlas of Middle-earth. So her decision was to make a map of a fantasy world based on modern realism's representations. Okay, and I could go into similar discussions about the third dimension. I'm not going to, because we're running out of time. And she would constantly be looking for representations that she could use. So my family went to Mammoth Cave in Kentucky one time, right? Oh, give me the map, because then you look, and then somewhere in an atlas, you'd see something look just like that. Like I found this map actually in her map stack as an example. She used perspective for close-up things like caves and buildings and so on. That is a choice. Right? You don't have to use three-point perspective. For example, again, in the Chinese, you could use convergent geometry. Those of us who are slightly older remember video games when they used isometric perspectives instead of the perspective that your eye uses. Everything has the same scale. That's another choice. By the way, for those of you geographers who are in here, it's not possible, I don't think, in the main GIS programs to actually click a button on a map and have it come up in this perspective, because everything in those software is made for your eyes perspective. And I think it's really annoying that our choices in these software are limited. Uh-oh, my battery is running low. That'll be fine. Just a couple other representational questions. The Misty Mountains are really, really long. If you were to look at them on a map, individual mountains would be really, really tiny, but not on her maps. You can actually see them. Right? So this is a thing in cartography called cartographic generalization. And it's kind of a lie we make in order to make the landscape seem real. And this lie is all over the atlas because you have to do that. By the way, we do that for real world maps sometimes too. I'm going to skip a bit because of time. In hand cartography, very difficult to draw gradients. You kind of have to you're forced to break up the world into chunks. Here's where it's colder or warmer. We're going to have, that's not how the real world works. We have gradients in the real world. Very difficult to do that by hand. Even today with modern computer cartography, it's difficult. But the choices are limited not only by your mental maps, but also by the tools that you have. Okay, speaking of tools, drafting table, books, calculators, you got to buy the material, like things we don't have to worry about these days. The tools are manual tools. And then we have the real problem. Tolkien didn't decide on how to do things all at one time. He kept changing things throughout his life. And I'm going to describe Numenor, which if you watch The Rings of Power, which you shouldn't do, but if you watch it, that's what he's talking about. and didn't describe the island. So my mother drew what she thought the island was. And then a week after she finished the atlas, Christopher Tolkien published the Unfinished Tales and had this map. So she asked the publishers, can I go back and redraw? And so you get the map on the right. So the problem is just, she doesn't get to do this all in one chunk, constantly changing. In fact, during the 1980s, the History of Middle-earth series was published, all these volumes, some of which had big changes to the original. So she asked permission to do a revised version. Here's an example of one of the changes. This is called the Ambarkanta map number 5. This is in the Shaping of Middle-earth, History of Middle-earth book. It for one map finally shows where all the continents and stuff are. Like that never existed before. So my mother immediately changed her map for the revised version. And if you look at it, it looks exactly like Ambarkanta 5. It's just with more detail. Okay, I'm going to zoom ahead. Here's an example that changes. This is, with the exception of the red color, that don't mind the red color. This would be like the first edition versus second edition. And you can see the big differences. That comes from that one little diagram from Tolkien. So the second edition was published in 1991. If you go to a store and buy the Atlas of Middle-earth, that's the version that you'll see. Okay, there are limitations. Yeah, you're limited by the number of pages the publisher wants. At the time, color was very expensive. It's still expensive to make a book like that. So she was limited to only 3 or 4 colors. She was limited to size. Like she had to make very specific map sizes. So if you go upstairs, all the maps have this sort of same sort of size as choices. Can't do full color, not in the Atlas of Middle-earth. You got to have some skills. You got to make an atlas, and they're not all cartography, right? You have to be able to research. You have to be able to organize well. You have to be able to mental map very well. You have to have some artistic ability, right? You have to have writing skills and editing skills. You have to be able to budget really well and schedule really well. And you have to be able to converse with your publisher really well. I have hundreds of letters between her and the publisher. So I'm ending with this slide. What would
Talking to her computer so that we don't have to worry about the slide.
I'm sorry, there was no point here. Okay. Sorry about that, everybody.
Turn your video.
So I'm just going to finish here, if that's okay. It was literally 20 seconds from being done.
Right. There you go.
We have a different set of visualizations today that we think of when we think of realism. Like if that's a goal of yours, realism, what are we used to today? Well, it's not mid-20th century maps, not so much anymore, right? When we think of realism, we think of Google Earth, right? Or animated maps or Google Maps that you're using to, we have a whole different set of representations in our mind for what constitutes realism. If you then say to a cartographer, or if a cartographer decides, I want to do a realistic map, it only kind of works to use mid-20th century realism representations. So if I wanted to do the Atlas of Middle-earth today, I would have to think about how to generate maps that look like remote sensing images or Google Earth images. There are ways to do that, by the way, but it's a whole different skill set. If instead you said, I'm not super interested in realism, I want to make it look more like a fantasy map, you could just get out a digital Wacom tablet like artists use and do exactly the same kind of thing that my mother did. It would be much easier because you wouldn't have to mess with all the layers and everything else, but basically it would be the same kind of art. That's your decision as a cartographer. There are an infinite number of maps that you can make. The question is, what do you want and who is it for? Thank you very much, everybody. Sorry. Sorry. Okay. So I am happy to take, do you want to manage questions? I know we've got two of these going.
We might want to go back and forth between in-person and Zoom.
Okay.
But we'll have to look at the Zoom on
I
here.
should also, as we're setting up here, I should also mention, please go up and see the maps if you haven't already. That would probably be really good. They're just upstairs, 3rd floor.
Any questions in the audience?
Yeah.
I was looking at some of the older maps, some of the ones from the Jackson director's cuts, and it occurred to me, what was your mother's reaction? She might
You
have
like
forgotten-
those? Yeah, so she liked those movies. It's interesting because I was with her that she was dying of cancer, but she managed to get through all the movies, including the extended version. She was one of that 1% of the public that she could tell every single difference between the book and the, movies, obviously. And I think she really enjoyed the movies. I think her philosophy at the time was, it's like if you describe the Battle of Troy in the Iliad. All right, Homer wrote about the battle and he wrote it this way. And then what if somebody else had written about it from their perspective? And you had two, that's how I think how she viewed the movies. We're like, well, Tolkien wrote these books and somebody else made a movie about it. They're the same, but it's about the same thing. That was her mindset, I think, at the time. That allowed her to enjoy it. Otherwise, like somebody like a Christopher Tolkien did not like Peter Jackson's movies because he knew every single thing that was in the books and what his father had focused on. Right? But my mother kind of avoided that issue, I guess. Great question.
I need to repeat the question again.
Oh,
Yeah,
sorry. Right, this kid
There
here.
was another question.
I was just gonna ask, I didn't know anything about the exhibit before. What inspired you to basically give like a dedication to your mom's work, and like how did it happen like today?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the simple answer is, back in November, October, a guy who used to live in Oshkosh, where I grew up, where my mother did her work, wrote an article about my mother in the New York Times. Because she never got an obituary in the New York Times at the time she died. So he wrote this, and that garnered a lot of interest in her work. And at the time, I remembered that my father and I had, over the past 2 or 3 years, had really been wondering about what to do with all of her maps, because they were in a closet. They were kept well, but they were still in a closet. And so we really wanted a place to archive these maps permanently. And as part of that, I thought what I really want to do is scan all of these maps, get them digitally. And you can't just do that on a little home flatbed scanner. And so I ended up being invited to come here and do an interview for Wisconsin Public Radio back in March. And I thought, if I'm going to do that, I'm going to ask Geography Department, of which I know very well, if I can use their drum scanner to scan the map. So that's what I've been doing most of the summer. And that led to, well, if we're going to do that, and there were people interested, we might as well, let's have a show. So that's how that happened. Yes. Oh, I forgot the question. Question is, did his mother find any notable inconsistencies in Tolkien's writing from which she just had to pick a right cartographic solution? The answer is yes. Tolkien was actually very good about being consistent, much better than most authors. But a good example of the mistake one was that one I showed of the distances of travel between Bag End and Rivendell. There are a few others. They were mostly minor. Mostly the problems are ones of omission, not of inconsistency. Great question. Yeah.
Do you think the techniques with mapping fantasy world and mapping the real world, do they have, is there anything to learn from each of those exercises? And I mean, in fact, if you think about it, I mean, all maps are sort of a fantasy way.
Right.
They're a representation of something that's in the cartography.
Yeah, absolutely. So the question is, what can you take from fantasy cartography and apply to modern cartography? Is that basically it? Yeah, so one thing about fantasy cartography is that it is very immediately abstract, right? You can't immediately tie it to any everyday thing. It's very abstract. And because of that, you have to be very deliberate about your choices. You have to be, okay, it's fantasy world. How am I going to represent something very deliberately? In the process, I'm going to start with a mental map, and then I'm going to doodle, and then I'm going to go to this layer. So there's a process when you deal with fantasy cartography, because you can't just look at a real place. I think many of those processes are very helpful in making real world maps. Instead of just skipping to the button I can push to get this layer of this place, to actually go through the process of the mental process of deciding what you want first is actually very important. And really good cartographers, and I like to point at my Atlas of Yellowstone. I think there's a Wild Migrations Atlas over there. So these are done by Infographics, the cartography lab at my university. A huge amount of time is spent trying to imagine what it'll look like when you're done. Like, what if I do it this way? What will it look like? What if I do it this way? What will it look like? That gives you choice. And that is a thing that translates very well from the fantasy world to the realistic cartography. Good. Others? Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm curious if any other companies ever reached out to either your mother or the manufacturer in the state to use her cartographic expertise in other middle products.
I see. So the question is, did other entities besides Houghton Mifflin ask my mother to for use of her work beyond Houghton Mifflin, the publisher? So the simple answer is no. Her work is published by Houghton Mifflin. It's Houghton Mifflin's job to say you can or can't use it. And many people have done that. Of course, her other work that wasn't done for Houghton Mifflin can be done for whoever, but her specific, so the bigger question for me is, what about her draft work? Is that actually owned by Houghton Mifflin? So that's like a thing for lawyers, and the archive people can struggle with that. But I think the simple answer to your question is no.
Kind of related to what you said, but so you have, these maps or the that your mother drew have not been outside the US or Wisconsin.
Not the physical map, not the physical draft maps. Yeah.
And that travels internationally.
Sure, a traveling exhibit.
The entire setup and make it more, I don't know, like
So
fans of the talking books.
I will simplify your question by saying this. It's very likely that soon the maps upstairs will be donated to an archive, professional archive, like hopefully within weeks. When that happens, technically it's their decision about where it goes. Are they going to have other shows and so on? I know there's interest both within the United States and outside. Ultimately, it would be their decision. They ask me what I thought about, I say they, one of the groups I'm working with for potential archiving, asked me about that. And I'm like, I would love for everybody to see it. In fact, frankly, I'm kind of a geek. I like virtual reality, and I would love to put them all in virtual reality so you can walk around and look at them. Because upstairs, you're only seeing a small fraction. I apologize, I didn't ask the question again.
I think they got the gist.
Good, okay.
Anyway. How are we with time?
26.
All right, we've got a few more minutes.
Yeah.
I'm interested in the literary aspect of the translation from book form, text form.
Yep.
To that. And so thinking of that list of skills that your mother had, a key literary eye had to be one of them. So I'm wondering if she had training or inclination in literary studies or narrative studies in order to be able to do that translation. And then you mentioned a couple ways that Tolkien's work lends itself well to this translation.
Yeah.
Sticking to realistic and
Yeah.
for the most part, and doable, distances of things.
Yeah.
But is there anything else about his style, his narrative style, that lends itself well to mapping?
Yeah. So the basic question is the transition or the movement from text to map. Did my mother have training for that? And what things about J.R. Tolkien's work were good to make that transition? So the simple answer for the first question is no. I don't think she had really any training of that. Except one of the things as a geographer. So geography is a broader sort of discipline than cartography, which is just a part of it. Part of geography is that transition. And so in order to make an atlas of Middle Earth, you have to know a lot about Earth and how it's represented, how people write about it, how, that. So becoming a geographer is in a way a part of that translation. The question about J.R. Tolkien is more challenging. I think there are a few things he did that allowed so many people to make illustrations of his work. One of them is that he was very, very dense in his writing. When I mean dense, I mean you open up any page of any of his books and he gives a great amount of detail. He was very internally consistent. He didn't have a lot of detail, but it wasn't consistent with one another. He deliberately chose to represent his world with landforms and peoples and things that were almost exactly like we encounter in every day. That's the realism part. And even the rules of those worlds are very Earth-like. Right? They have the same gravity and so on. Now, in fantasy and science fiction, there's no rule you have to do it that way. Like lots of stories are where things are much more fantastical than J.R. Tolkien did. And that makes it more challenging to do that translation. But and my mother, I think, consciously picked authors who wrote in that kind of realistic tradition. And McCaffrey was probably one of the furthest out, but even Anne McCaffrey's works are trying to be kind of realistic. She didn't choose ones that were widely fantastical because I think she would have had a real challenge doing that translation. Great question, yeah.
To follow up on that, did any authors reach out to her, or did she pick the one she wanted to do? Like, did any authors reach out, like, can you draw my world for me, kind of thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. Did any authors reach out to her to do world? I don't think so. I know that, so the second book she did was the Atlas of Pern. This is with Anne McCaffrey. I know that after having worked with Anne would suggest my mother to read certain books. Also, so she worked with Judy Lynn Del Rey, who was a publisher, published the Del Rey publishers, and it was Judy, so not the author, but Judy suggested a couple of authors. She suggested the authors that eventually became the Atlas of Dragonlance. She suggested the authors eventually became the Atlas of the Forgotten Realms. So it wasn't really author to my mother, it was more like publisher. I think people wanting to publish their artistic work don't realize how important publishers are because they're so used to just doing it themselves. But publishers are the kind of the main filter through everything, deciding what you get to do and for whom.
Right, let's see. We have time for maybe one more quick question. If anyone on Zoom or anyone in here has a quick question to finish up.
Yeah.
Well, as she's staying in one age of Middle Earth, of course, they're transferring across and they're seeing these huge images along the river of the past culture. Did she like try to get into showing those points where you're looking at the old huge statues going down the river below Rivendell or something?
Yeah. So the question is like, right. So actually it's kind of both. Now you got me thinking. So the simple answer to your question is no. The publishers, certainly in the first version of the Atlas, were kind of worried about her Atlas kind of going too far into the realm of art. There are many artists of Tolkien's world, Alan Lee and John Howe and other people like that. And they knew that the thing that was different was the map part of it. So they kind of warned her not to go down. And she was absolutely had enough artistic ability to have done that. She kind of wanted to a little bit. So when the revised version came along and they allowed her to do about a third of the book is revised. That was all that they were willing to reprint. She kind of snuck in a few things kind of like that. But if you go upstairs and see some of the later Alice's she does, more and more you'll see stuff like that. So unfortunately, the only things that you can see that are like that, that show that depth of history and artistic way, all that you really get from that are the maps for the most part in the Alice in Middle Earth. I want to thank you, everybody. I really appreciate your time. And I want to thank those of you on Zoom. I apologize that we had this technical goof right at the end, but hopefully you could still hear me. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Go upstairs.